All right. Well, thank you very much for being here, and welcome to Pack West Bigfoot. This is David, and first and foremost, I want to say thank you guys so very much for your kind responses here on YouTube, and I want to say thank you very much for following me on PackWestBigfoot.com and here on YouTube as well. Let's see. Anything in the news? No, not really. I'm still working on a whole bunch of encounters stories that I've gotten from a whole bunch of wonderful folks like yourself up here in the beautiful Pacific Northwest. And I just want to say, I've had a lot of people ask me if I'm going to be doing any encounter stories outside of the Pacific Northwest. Come January, I'm going to start doing some live interviews, and so I will have those available come around the first week or second week of January. Now, those live interviews will be about 30 to 40 minutes long, and they will be from encounters all over North America. However, the encounter stories that are sent to me here directly into PackWestBigfoot.com, and these individuals usually, they don't mind their story being shared, but they're not much for interviews, will be put here on the blog, and you can follow along here on the blog and YouTube. So that's what's going to happen there. Anything else? No, not really. I will be picking out a name on the 21st. You will get an email from me if you're not already subscribed to PackWestBigfoot.com, P-A-C, WestBigfoot.com. You can get over there and subscribe and get yourself in for the free monthly drawing. I got a cool prize coming out. And once I draw that name and email, guess what? I will contact you. You can give me your address, and I will mail it on out to you. So with that, let's get to this week's encounter story. This one is called Bird Watching Turns to Bigfoot Watching at the Yontocket Slough in Northern California. And I wanted to say something real quick about this one. In all honesty, I was really kind of taken aback by this one just because of some of the, I guess you say some of the things, the mannerisms or kind of the things that these Bigfoot were doing. So let's just get into the story and you'll kind of understand what I'm talking about. And then you can take from this whatever you believe. If you have anything to say it down in the comments. If you have any, maybe your 2 cents to put in about their behavior at this time, I will be approving all comments that are approve worthy. So there we go. And if you want to be a part of that conversation, great. I will approve your comments as long as they are part of the conversation. Okay? With that, let's get in here. My name is Wayne, and that is my real name, Dave, and you can use it. I wanted to share my brief but real sighting of Bigfoot I had while bird watching at the Yontocket Slough in Northern California. It is a brief sighting, but there was more than one Bigfoot. Actually, there were two, and I think they were mates, or wanting to be mates, I suppose. But here is my sighting, and if you could, Dave, get back to me with what you think these things really are, and if you think I'm safe to go back out there again, or if I should stop. Actually, to tell you the truth, guys, real quick, Wayne has been out there numerous times since, so just so you know. Bigfoot, watching on the Yontocket Slough. So let's get into our encounter story. Let me start by saying I am in my late 50s and opted for early retirement from a government job I held for 30 years here in Northern California. I live in Crescent City, California, and I spend a ton of my retirement either crabbing, fishing, hunting, or my favorite pastime, bird watching. My wife loves to follow me and take pictures herself, as she is a photographer professionally speaking, when she can, of course. Her thing is weddings for the most part, but she does enjoy getting out and taking some beautiful scenic pictures too from time to time. Personally, I love it when she comes along. She is my best friend and my wife, after all. The gray-jayed California towhee, northern mockingbird, black turnstone, black oyster catcher, and the red-breasted merganser are just some of my favorite birds I like to watch from the Northern California coastline to the inland areas like the Yontocket Slough. The slough is actually one of my favorite places to visit and birdwatch. It is literally just down the road from where I live, about 15 miles to be exact. Yes, I love the beaches for birdwatching too, but I live on the beach and it's nice to get a little more inland once in a while. But between the slough and the redwood forests in which I practically live, I like the slough. It has less distractions, making it easier to spot some awesome birds. But now that my intro to why I was there that day is done, let me tell you what happened as briefly as I can. Morning on the Yontocket Slough. So I packed up the car with what I would need for about a 6 or 7 hour day of bird watching in the slough. Of course, I like getting to places right before sunrise, and I mean literally right before sunrise. That morning was to start around 6 a.m., so with everything packed and a peck on the wife's cheek, I was out the door and headed up the highway. It is a great place, you know. Here you have the great vast ocean on one side and some of the oldest and largest trees in the world in the redwood forest on the other. Just beautiful. But back to the sighting. It was late September, actually. It was the last day of the month, to be exact. And just knowing that I would see such a creature within 2 hours of being there today, well, if I had to do it over again, I probably would. I would be very hesitant, and if you see these things for yourself, you'll know what I mean. I pulled up to a little parking area that actually has a little bridge that you can walk out on. The bridge stood about 8 to 9 feet off the ground, and that is where the deck started, not the rails. Using the height of that, plus getting a good enough look at the background against where these things stood for a few moments, I could get a good sense of how tall they were, at least the male. It would be the next day that I came back out and walked over to where they were, and yes, I was armed just in case. But before I describe what they looked like, let me describe the scene and what they were doing at that moment. Like I said, it was early when I pulled up and walked out onto the observation platform. Well, that's what I call that small bridge, of course. It had two benches built in and some information on a billboard of the wildlife and birds that can be spotted along the slough. However, they were apparently missing a whole species. As the light started to grow over the wetlands, birds of all kinds started to fly about here and there. Bird watching is relaxing. It is fun, and you can learn a lot about the world around you when you decide to give it a bit of room and time to teach you something. Today it taught me that more than what I know about the world can exist, and that myth is not always myth, no matter what some may believe. After the first hour of checking out some black turnstones for a bit, I decided to take a seat for a few and eat my apple fritter I picked up on the way, and drink some of the awesome coffee my wife made me. She is such a thoughtful woman, and I am a lucky man, I tell you. It was at that moment that things started to get interesting. Not that I really knew it at that moment. That is just a moment I remember things starting to get weird right before the sighting. Knock, knock. Who's there? It all started with knocking. Later, days later, as I started doing some research on the subject of Bigfoot, the knocking I heard did sound like smaller logs being knocked against standing trees. So are they really knocks? I guess if you hit it just right, yes. Then I would say that the wood knocks are what I started to hear that moment. From where I was situated on the slough, I was facing north, and as you can tell on a map, this particular slough runs pretty far to the east and west. But to the north and south, it is really not all that wide. As a matter of fact, where I sat, there was water, some smaller coniferous trees, then wide open wetlands, all backed by forest about 225 yards to the north. The knocking echoed across the open wetland and came from the more northeasterly direction. It caught my attention enough to actually stand up and grab my binoculars. I thought I might have some breed of woodpecker I was about to have the pleasure of viewing. I scanned the horizon just over the open area and into the tree line, but nothing moved. I sat back down a minute later to finish my breakfast. Knock, knock. This time it came from the northwesterly direction. I thought perhaps a male and female woodpecker may be trying to talk or notify each other. Knock, knock, knock. This time 3, and this time from the original position. This time, however, I was actually paying attention to the sound, and the sound was not a woodpecker at all. It sounded more like a log or a large piece of wood hitting a tree, not a more hollow knocking sound a woodpecker makes. The knocking continued on for about a half an hour. I continued to scan back and forth across the horizon about tree level, but it was so dark in the tree line that I could not make out anything, not a bird inside or an animal. I finished eating my donut as the knocks continued for a few more minutes. Once they stopped, that is when things got really strange. I heard 2 whoops, like a primate type of monkey-sounding whoop. Although this is a louder, deeper whoop, than the ones I heard at the San Francisco Zoo a while back. I mean, you could tell whatever it was had a huge set of lungs to carry that far across the open area. I know it is open, but that was a loud whoop. She and he Bigfoot, huh? It was getting interesting. About 2 hours after getting here, I was hearing knocks, whoops, and even something that resembled whistling back and forth started up. I decided to try and get a closer look near the tree line, so I grabbed a better pair of binoculars out of my backpack quietly. I did not know if whatever it was had sensitive hearing or not, but I wanted to listen some more and did not want to scare it or them off. It was about 8 a.m. by that time, and it was bright enough now to see across the slough a little better. Of course, it was still a foggy morning, being near the coastline and all, but I could see better nonetheless. I heard another whoop and a tree knock, almost at the same time, and at that moment I saw motion from the northwest side of the slough in the tree line. I have seen the Patty film recently, and I have to tell you, it was either a twin or a relative, because this large, dark female Bigfoot stepped out of the tree line about 10 yards and into the open, and you could clearly see it was a female. She must have been about 7 feet tall, give or take a few inches or so. And the weight, well, I would be guessing, but I'd say around 400 to 500 pounds, maybe. Through the large pair of binoculars, I could make out at least some detail, like the color of the hair, the definition of the body, how it moved. And I could make out a bit of the face, but not as well as everything else. The hair on her was very dark black color, and it almost shimmered, which was most likely due to it being wet or damp outside that morning. The hair was matted, too, here and there around the hips and legs, from what I could tell. The face was lighter than anything else on the body, that I could see. No ears I could make out, and there was not much of a neck either. I could not make out the nose, mouth, and eyes very well, other than that the eyes seemed to be large. But man, that thing was big, Dave. I have never seen anything that big before, until a minute later. Literally a minute later. Before that, however, I have to mention that the arms were long. They seemed to have reached to her knees, maybe just past them. She also paused to look around her in every direction. During her pause, I noticed that she would have to move her body to a point to look even a little bit in any direction. Not to mention, when she started to look around, she first dropped to all fours. The he. More movement came from the northeast at that moment, and I also noticed that she, the female, all of a sudden became as still as a statue and remained on all fours. I thought she was huge. The monster I now saw stood 2 heads above her, and I could not see any breasts, so I took it that this was a male Bigfoot. The hair on this one was not as long as the female's. However, the body itself was almost the same, like the long arms, the long face, no real neck, what I could see. The male stared at the female for what seemed about 30 seconds or so. They both, at first, were as still as statues. The female made the first move by getting up off all fours and looked as though she was now talking to the male. I could see some movement of the face from there and hands moving a bit, but I could not hear anything. After about 15 seconds of that, the male stepped closer to the female, actually rather quickly, within about 15 or so feet from her all of a sudden. What a stride it had! It must have cleared 45 feet in mere steps. The female started up with the hands and I believe talking. However, this time, every few seconds or so, I could hear the male make a loud grunt of sorts. I could not believe what I was seeing. These were supposed to be creatures of myth, something on the front of a t-shirt you buy for fun. Not real. Legends of folklore, for crying out loud. At that moment, the female made a move toward the male, and they were now within just a few feet of each other. This time, however, he moved down to all fours for about 15 to 20 seconds at least. The female looked as though she were talking or chatting again. He was motionless. Seconds later, the opposite happened. She was on all fours, and he looked as though he were chatting, and once again that deep, weird grunt was heard. Gathering my thoughts for the briefest of moments, I reached inside my pocket to grab my cell phone. back then in 1999, we did not have smartphones. We just had dumb ones. I hit redial to call my wife real quick, and of course I was real slow with the movements just in case. I guess that is all the practice paying off from all the bird watching through the years. However, I had it on speaker. The phone dial started doing the beeping tone thing with the numbers, and if you could believe it, those two creatures could hear those beeps from all the way over there, nearly 200 yards away. They looked right in my direction. Shoot, they looked right at me. Bigfoot watching ends with a scream. It was crazy, but the male leaped towards the female Bigfoot and got between it and myself as far as line of sight is concerned. She disappeared into the woods before I can even blink an eye. Once she was out of sight, that large monster of a creature or whatever let out a scream I never want to hear again. From around 200 yards away, I heard a deep guttural roar turn into a crazy, scary, maddening, high-pitched scream from, H-E-double-L. That thing then dropped to all fours, screamed out again, just shorter this time, and then stood up and walked off into the thick forest and out of sight. Bigfoot Watcher today. Suffice it to say, Dave, I'm a bird and Bigfoot watcher today. These days, though, I carry cameras and smartphone and an audio recording device everywhere I go, and I have them at the ready. There have been a few good audios I have gathered for the local BFRO I am a part of, but to this day, no more sightings as of yet. It was really frightening in the sense that they were simply enormous and scary to look at. But being as far away as I was, well, I'm glad I had this sighting. At least now I can help add to the real accounts out here and be a voice of reason. I still think they were in the middle of mating or courtship of some kind. The way in which they moved was incredibly interesting. From the way they would stand to the gestures I could see them make, well, it was just really weird, scary, and interesting all at the same time. But thanks for letting me tell about my encounter. Hope your community can take what they can from this experience. Wayne.